we know that the data that we presented is not, there's some questions about it and it doesn't tell the whole picture. So
Jeffrey, that's where I was going to start today. So why don't we go ahead and get started? You know, Bethany and Ainsley, I noticed that we're missing quite a few work group members, and I think we may have been missing some folks for our last meeting as well. Are you taking attendance for us so we get a sense of who we might need to reach out to engage?
I believe so. Yeah, I can start doing that for sure.
Okay. Well, we have a small group. Susan, are you okay if we get started?
Sure.
Okay, excellent. So, hello everyone. This is the Juvenile Justice Processes and System Coordination Work Group meeting. It's our second meeting. Thank you for being here today. Our first meeting was on February 21st. And as many of you know, at that meeting, we had two presentations made. The first was a data presentation on youth charged as adults by GoCap. And then the second presentation was a presentation by the Sentencing Project, Josh Rovner of the Sentencing Project, on youth in the adult system in Maryland and beyond, nationwide. Those were great presentations. And if you don't have them, they're in our shared Dropbox. You all should have the link to the shared Dropbox. If not, Ainsley can assist you in that. So where do we go today? Susan and I were thinking about this in light of the fact that the two bills seeking to limit auto charging did not survive crossover day in the Maryland General Assembly. And so what Susan and I are proposing to the work group today is that we recommend that GoCap make a formal request for disaggregated data to the Office of the Administrative Courts. We know that that data request will take time to fulfill, but that's okay, because our thought is we request that data with an eye toward the commission making formal recommendations regarding auto charging to the governor and to the Maryland General Assembly for the 2026 legislative session. We can talk about where we move on while we're waiting for that data. We'll continue to move on to a different topic. But our thought is that we spend time today just making sure that we're all on the same page about the disaggregated data that we need. And Ainsley or Jeff, in a minute, I may ask you to pull up the next step slides of the presentation so we can look at that. And then we thought we'd just open it up to the group for any discussion about the presentations. We didn't really have much of a chance to debrief before we talk about what topic we move on to next while we're waiting for the data. I know Jenny is here from DJS and may have some more to share about other data that we could use as we try to formulate a commission recommendation in addition to what we get from the Office of the Administrative Courts. So Susan, do you have anything you want to, anything you'd like to share in terms of opening remarks right now?
I agree with that. I am a little concerned because when I went back to see what the last commission did, they had the exact same problem with getting information from the courts. And even though they couldn't get that information from the courts, they went forward with a recommendation. I understand that because the session, we're not going to get it this session, we have some more time to get it, but I think we have to be very clear about what we want. And then also the court, if they can't give it to us, we have to move forward. All I'm saying is I'm willing to step back now because we really don't have a platform to make a recommendation. But we do, if you read through all these reports, it's the exact same story. We're waiting for the courts. We're waiting for the courts. And it does show a problem that's a bigger problem, which is that the courts and the executive branch are not coordinated at all as far as data. And so when you try to tell a picture of anything, it makes it confusing. And I don't know if that's an issue that we take up with the full commission, because they're trying to figure out, what issues are crossover issues. And then the other thing is, I think we have a real messaging problem. And of course, that's Nate's. He's going to take care of that. And so, I think if we do get the commission to recommend and we do go forward, we need a new name for this bill. Anyway, that's just my brief comments, and we can move
Thank
on.
you so much. So Denise, Nate, and Secretary Schiraldi, you're the three actual members of the work group. Does this sound like any objections to proceeding in this way today?
No, I'll say no. I don't. Not at all. I think it's great. I think data's our friend and should be our friend when we try to set public policy. I know that's a unique view. But I wondered. I wasn't aware. I knew that things came slowly when the previous commission was looking for stuff, but I just assumed that's what always happens in government. I didn't realize it was actually data that was not provided ultimately, and that because I look at the data back then and look at the analysis, and I'm impressed by it. It seems quite good, and I didn't realize that there were any gaps in it. I thought it actually told a fuller picture than I ever normally get to see.
So, Jeff, I definitely want to hear what you have to say. I mean, when we had the presentation on February 21st, you all were picking up on the gaps in real time in a way I wasn't, because wasn't able to. I'm not as quick as most of the people on this call. But when I sat down afterwards with the presentation, I could see the gaps pretty clearly. And I think that, the gaps we were talking about were that the aggregated data was looking at charges versus cases and kids. That was one major gap. And then for me, a second major gap was when we were trying to track case outcomes in the adult system. It was difficult because the courts were providing numbers on the cases filed in a fiscal year and then cases disposed of in that same fiscal year, but there was no way to know if they were the same cases, if that's making sense. So, Secretary, am I making sense to you right now?
You are.
Okay. Jeff, go ahead.
One of my comments, I know that we're talking about getting access to data. The nice thing that we have is that there's already a legislative mandate out there, which we covered last time. There's actually 2 juvenile charges adults bills, but the second one is juveniles charged, convicted, and sentenced as adults. So we have the legal means around that, and we've already communicated with the courts. It was just the first go around was the aggregate data, but I thought we could use a little bit of this time. I know that you want us to probably go over the next step side, which we're happy to do. We've already been in strong collaboration with John Irvin's team at DJS to make sure that we're asking for what's legislatively required. We're asking for data that will benefit DJS, and then we have a separate federally funded project where we're collecting data on the entire juvenile justice system. So there's kind of 3 working parts, but I think with the legislation already out there, that gives us the extra legal means that we have to request data from the courts. And I know generally the law says outcomes of cases involving juveniles charged as adults. So it is very broad, but then this is the list. Thanks for sharing, Ainsley. This is I came up with this list with my team in collaboration with John Irvin's team about what we want to ask from the courts. Are they going to have all of this? I don't 100% know. We're hoping that they at least have 80% of it, but we would get this down to the case level. And as far as identifiers goes, we wouldn't need a juvenile's name, but we would like some type of unique person ID just so we know that this is attributed to a specific juvenile. So we would have the court system that it came from, the jurisdiction, the date of the incident, and the charge and filing date, anything related to any transfer hearings. So the event, hearing date, the disposition of that. So you would know if they stayed in the adult court, if they were waived back down to DJS. I don't know if they're going to have petition ID and petition date. That was something that the DJS side wanted. Obviously, we want any demographics that they have, case number, all charging information. So if there's 5 charging events related to one juvenile, we would want all 5 charge numbers and charge descriptions, CJIS codes, offense classifications, and then if it stayed in the court system, what were the outcomes of those, including any sentence lengths, things like that, any plea information, sentencing date. We've gotten other court data, so we know that a lot of those fields already exist. So it's just a matter of kind of narrowing our request down for this. So the intent would then be to, rather than providing aggregate counts or saying here there were 25 juveniles and 30 cases and 72 charges, we would provide data on every single juvenile and what happened in every single one of those cases from the time that they were charged as an adult to the time that they either got sentenced in the adult system or were waived back down, so we can provide the full universe of data. And we would probably build that out into some type of dashboard, maybe sequence maps, something like that, based on all of this data. And obviously you could filter that data by demographics, by jurisdiction, by charge types, by age, any of that information. That's the pie in the sky end goal. We're hoping to get there, but we can certainly use this work group to kind of help, narrow our request down so that we're asking information that benefits you all as well.
Information that any of the members would like to see, or are there any items on here that we would want removed? Can everybody hear me okay? I feel like my connection is in and out.
Yeah.
Okay,
Hear you
great.
great. My only thought, and I don't have the answer to this, is how to track case processing time, including the time from charge and filing date. For me, does that mean the charge and filing date in district court or circuit court? Because they each have their own date. And so we might need to break that down. When was it charged in district? When was it indicted in circuit court? So that we could see those timelines, because the timeline and the length of time between a transfer hearing and initial charging might be an issue. The only other thing I want to flag that I'm seeing in our data is that we sometimes have youth with charges and filing data in different counties, and I just don't know how that's going to show up here. So for example, a child will be charged as an adult in Baltimore City and Hartford County will file a waiver against them. And so just breaking how we're going to break those things down and tie them to one youth. I think the youth identifier will fix that, Jeffrey, but I just wanted to say that those are the things that I'm seeing the most that complicate my data collection, which are cross count, one transfer and one waiver for the same kid in different counties, as well as the charge and filing dates in circuit and district court needing to be broken down.
Yeah, that was our intent with the unique ID. And then as far as the dates, like any of these date fields, we can certainly embed any types of formulas needed to subtract from the time that the date may have been, the offense may have been committed to all the different hearings. Like we would request any types of dates, like all court hearings. So that would be our intent. We know that they're not going to have a field for that, but we can try to track all of those dates and compile all the metrics ourselves, depending upon whatever dates you're interested in knowing.
I have one question. From a previous Vera report, it said something like they can't get information about the district court. They could get the circuit court, but there is a problem with the district court. Is the information that you're requesting going to cover both of them?
That's what we have under court system. So that would, for us, that would be district court and circuit court.
Okay. And do you know why the district court was a problem?
District court, I don't know. 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 I don't have any recollection. I know that for any of these cases, they're going to be eventually wind up in the circuit court system. I think one thing we would want to make sure is that we found this with other court data we've received, that we're not counting duplicate cases. Like, so we don't want to count the outcomes in district court if that case then gets waived to the circuit court side. I don't know if there would be any district court cases where there is no overlap with circuit in this particular, until we see the data, we just won't really know. But that could be the only hypothesis that I would have, is that they all wind up in circuit court eventually. But I don't have any other explanation for that.
Okay. But
Susan,
for-
MDEC wasn't statewide yet. So this was the data collection was 2017 and we were doing it in 2019. I think both PG and Baltimore City weren't yet on MDEC. And so there wasn't a uniform way of district and circuit court talking. So I do think we're in a better data universe now.
Okay. So because I think it's very important to get the length of time. And if you can't get district court, you're missing out on the length of time. Okay.
Sure.
Thank you.
And I think I'll just say that I think that case processing times are something that absolutely need to be looked at. And, we'll have a discussion once we get the data back, months from now, probably closer to the session. But when we're talking about case processing times, I just want to make sure that, we talk about it being mindful of how much is at stake for these kids and how robust the defense needs to be. And so, maybe there are ways to shorten the case processing time within the current world of all of these youth being charged as adults, but we want to make sure we treat the disease and not the symptom, and have an eye, we'll have to get consensus, but certainly I'll have an eye toward limiting auto charging, not streamlining the process with the same universe of kids being auto charged. Secretary, go ahead. And Ainsley, do you mind ending the presentation so I can see everybody's faces? Thanks.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. That's the line we have to walk. We certainly don't want any public defender or any defender that's not a public defender thinking that they have to throw the kids under the bus. It also shouldn't take weeks for a judge's order to arrive on, in our computer to tell us to do an evaluation, and then weeks to get it from that first computer to an evaluator. There's that doesn't enhance the kid's defense in any way, shape, or form. That just is bureaucracies doing what they do when people who are defenseless are incarcerated. So I think there's plenty of areas we could focus on. I actually think the courts would welcome it. They want the kids to sit around. I just literally think there's a lot of stuff we just don't know because we're not, like, the data's not live for us all. And I think if we had a good chart that showed where the sticking points were, I think the good people that work in these systems would actually give a shit. I remember when I was in DC, we had a whole bunch of the stakeholders in a room in the Youth Services Center. And I remember it like it was yesterday because I had this old school consultant working with us, and she literally put a bunch of index cards with this fuzzy string attaching it to it. That one of the state's attorneys who was not a fan of this accelerating case processing thing, he thought it was bullshit, but he helped her lay out the process. So we had the process laid out on a wall, and then we did a dotocracy on where the sticking points were, and there was a remarkable amount of agreement as to where they were. And damn, if we want, and I think the best idea that came out of that was one of the judges said we should do X, and that really unstuck a lot. Didn't unstick it all, and there's due process takes time, and you can't undo that, but you can certainly undo delays that have nothing to do with the dispensation of justice.
So are we creating that chart now?
I think the data would help us do that,
Okay.
right? That would be a
Yeah,
dot, but with data. Sorry.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, sorry, I'm used to just cutting in, and I should be polite and raise my hand like everybody else. But no, what I'm thinking with the data side is, again, we have our legislative report. We're mandated to either produce a report and or dashboard to satisfy that legislative report. So we have that. We have this federal project. So another piece of this project is that we could provide, a dashboard that could be utilized by the commission to drive strategies to try to identify those pinch point areas. And then I believe, if I heard correctly during the beginning of the call, that the bill did not pass committee this year. So if we could iron out the data in this, I think we'll have a stronger case for the bill next year. If we show, how many youth meet this criteria, how many are actually, we still don't fully know what percentage of them are actually staying in the adult system. This data will show that with the data. And I think it's really going to have, you're going to have a much stronger case next year for session once we iron out all the data elements in here. If you want to you can pick out any crime that you want. So if you want to think about, adding what crimes you want to have taken away from the exclusionary criteria, we could use the dashboard to filter out those crimes so you can see the full universe of youth that you're looking at there. So I think we'll be at a much better place.
Thank you. And just, thinking about Secretary Schiraldi's last comment, and while we're waiting for next legislative session, when we get the data back, we could map out the processes and see if there's anything that can be done without undermining the defense, justice, or the defense of the child. And so, Jeff, what do you think? And Brianna, what do you think? A timetable. What do you think the timetable is for getting this back?
Well, I will say, I know we have a monthly call with DJS to discuss all things juvenile charges adults. I'm hoping by that meeting, which we actually have that meeting next week, we can have our draft data use agreement with the courts ready to go. We're going to have DJS look at it, make sure they're on the same page. We can also share that with you all to get your feedback, to make sure that we're all asking for what we want. And then we can send it out to the courts, get our signatures, and then it's basically just a waiting game at that point to actually receive the data. I'm confident if the data's anything like other courts data we've received, I'm confident that we could probably, in about a month's time, of course, I'm throwing Brianna under the bus here because she's going to be doing a lot of the data analysis, but I'm confident that in about a month's time, we should be able to build something out that's going to provide at least 85 to 90% of what you want. But it could take 6 months to get the data. I just don't really know. I'm confident in what we can do once we receive the data, and assuming that the data is digestible, which we've seen MDAC data before. It's not really, we can analyze the data. It's just how long is it going to take to get?
If there are delays, will you just keep us posted? So if there's something more you need from the commission to expedite things, we'll try to do that.
Absolutely.
Great. Nate and Denise, as members, anything else you want to add or discuss around this disaggregated data request?
I'm hoping that you guys are successful with getting what you need. Because I work in the court system, and what I've learned, because I travel to different jurisdictions, nobody does the same thing in these court systems. It's not, everybody has a different system of how they do things, especially with the juveniles. So I'm hoping you are successful with being able to collect the data you need.
And if we do run into issues, again, we do have the legislative mandate, so we can certainly put in language. We've done this before in other reports where we express that we just cannot complete the report because we haven't received the level of data needed. I mean, our report isn't just going to be court data. I know that we do have to get some local corrections data as well about those that are actually detained. That's another piece. I know that that's not really the focus of, I think the courts is going to have 85% of what everyone's interested in, but There are other data sets we have to track down as well, but I think the courts is like the white whale, the golden ticket that we're really all looking for.
Yeah. The only thing I would add is I think this is great, and I think in light of, again, the other work group that I'm involved with of the sort of narrative change and public education, I think one thing this can help do is get a common language around all this of like what's actually happening. Like I think that is important because people talk about it in different ways, and having more clarity on even these questions of like how many cases are there is really important to be able to talk about what's going on. Like, so the one thing that can come out of this is a very clean set of language that explains what's actually happening. And I think, I know for our work group, other work group, it's important that we're clear on what actually happens with young people who are charged as adults. Like what happens to young people in general through the system, but like explain what actually happens and what does it mean when right now we say something general, like about half the cases end up transferred down to DJS and the other half are dismissed or time served. But like that, what actually happens? Like, and I do think some of that court process like would be very helpful to understand what happens and when does it happen. Like, and I do think that that's missing. I agree when we're talking about when politicians have to discuss this, having more specific information that really explains it is important. Whether it sways people or not, I don't know, but that information is clear and that everyone is looking at the same thing is really important, because I think it is true that watching the hearings, there are certain things that are requested sometimes that someone might say, I just want to know, right? Like, I feel like Senator West in this last set, is like, which are the cases, what offenses are kids more likely than not transferred down, and which cases are that not happening? Like, that should be an easy thing to say, and it's not, right? It's just not an easy answer. And like that, being able to answer those types of questions would be great. And it sounds like, Jeff, what you're describing is we should easily be, if all these things that you're putting up would happen, we'd be able to answer those questions pretty easily. And I think that's a huge win.
Absolutely. I do want to caveat one thing, and we've started to witness this with some of the other data sets that we've received from other agencies, is we could probably use statewide totals for some things, but if we do want to drill down at the local level, that we do have to consider suppression counts. And I don't know what the court's parameters are going to be around that. Obviously, we make very filterable dashboards, and you could filter about 5 things, and going through those 5 filters, you may be able to identify one or two youth that meet that criteria. So that's just something that, we're certainly going to be mindful of, but there may be cases where we just have to go with statewide totals because we just can't drill down enough to where you may not be able to specifically identify the particular youth of interest. So that's just something to be mindful about. All this, we don't really know until we talk with the courts. We kind of default to 10 unless we hear otherwise from the people sending us the agents, the data. So that's just, something that we have to keep in mind with all this as well.
I was going to volunteer. I think that we do have some of that case processing data, or at least examples that we could give this group to walk through and help make that case processing map on how those things work. I could happily pull 5 of the most typical cases, or, given criteria, whatever this group wants, and walk you through what happened in some of those cases. I can show you extreme examples. I'm looking at a case in front of me right now where a child has waited between charging at age 15 and trial yesterday more than 1,600 days, right? He was charged at 15. He got a not guilty in adult court yesterday. And now he's 19 years old and coming back on DJS on probation after sitting in adult jail for almost 5 years. So that's like, I can show those extreme examples, and I can show the case processing in states and courts. I also think we have some examples of the ways that courts are doing it very differently in terms of how often and how far they set out transfer hearings that we could provide while we're waiting for that data. It is not complete, but it at least shows some snapshots of exactly what Nate was asking for, and I'd be happy to prepare that if that would be helpful for the group.
I would really love to. I mean, because that makes it understandable. I was looking at all these charts from Vera, and it was really confusing. And if you could just take us through, various cases, that would be great. I think it would really be helpful in us identifying, what we can do other than legislatively to make the case processing system work better. So maybe we could do that next meeting.
That's what I was going to ask the group next. Where do we turn next? But Secretary Schiraldi, you had your hand up. Do you want to make another comment before we kind of turn to next steps?
Yeah, just about what Jenny was saying. I think, Jenny, if you're going to make that presentation, you should also just talk a little about what you've been doing just on the DJS side of it to reduce case processing times, because it's dropped considerably month to month. And by the time we meet next, you'll have 2 months worth of data. And just on tightening our own stuff up, it's dropped a lot. And, I think you need to be very careful about identifying problems in other parts of the system, because that's a way a conversation like this can really blow up and become, worrisome and finger pointy and stuff like that. But you can certainly reveal our dirty laundry if you want, and what you're doing to clean it up.
Great.
Well,
go ahead.
So are you saying, Jenny, if we got, because, within the data, we would be able to filter down to the county. So your hypothesis is that the case processing times vary dramatically from county to county, and the data should show that then. Okay. So we can certainly use that that was something we were going to include in our analysis anyway, but that's definitely something that we'll be sure to emphasize when we start to put our analysis together when we get there. So.
Yeah. And there's lots of ways to talk about that. It's often the counties that don't have very frequent transfer hearings, right? So we have some counties that do one a year, and those case processing look very different because every judge and every prosecutor getting it's the only one they're going to do that year. And so even just having some conversations about the places that do it well, or that have found systems that cross over from district court to circuit court more smoothly, you can see the differences county by county for sure in the data.
Also, what the not just case processing times for sure, and what are the rates at which kids get tried as adults in different counties as compared to their caseloads. Some of the best research that gets done on the effects of waiver are based on differential rates of putting kids into the adult system, so you can compare county A to county B and say, oh, check it out. This kid who, was accused of a burglary went through the juvenile system, and, hundreds and hundreds of them, and they're similarly situated to the kid in county B who went through the adult system, just because that county decides that's the way that goes. And let's check out the outcome differences. And they're pretty damn profound, and not what people who want more kids tried as adults would urge from a public safety standpoint.
And that's the kind of material that Nate could really use in the messaging. So Jeff, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess this question is more for Secretary Schiraldi, and I know some of this may go back to the work on the governor's public safety performance cabinet and things like that. I know I've talked with John Irvin a bunch of times about trying to get better data that just really shows what percent of youth are committing these crimes. So we could try to take this data and maybe merge it up with census data, look at the percent of youth in each county, and then that number that actually get charged as an adult. And just those other metrics just kind of, I think, provide the whole picture as well. So that's something that just thinking about as we build this out, that we might be able to embed that data in there as well.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, John and I and Nate and Tom Woods and, a couple other folks were going back and forth on the other end of the system, because at some point I said in some of my testimony that like 3/4 of these kids are one and done. So don't make us put a lot of resources into them, because they're done. They don't come back. And Chair Clippinger was really surprised by that. And, I had met with him afterwards and we had conversations about it. He's like, I've never heard that before. It's like, yeah, that's the national data too. And so John pulled data from 4 years ago, and 72%, so it was almost 3/4, had one referral. And these weren't diverted kids. They were every kind of referral a kid could have, right? It wasn't like a petty theft. It could have been a carjacking. One referral. And then since then, and John had it up to February 27th, like 3 days before he sent me the data, no new referrals, no new adult arrests. And then I said, check out 2 and done. And it was another 14%. So 85% of the kids have come to us once or twice. It's the kids that come like 4 times that are the ones that are probably going to go back 5, 6, 7, and 8 times. But most males commit delinquent acts in their childhood. Mostly we don't get arrested. Mostly we stop doing it, as long as the system doesn't intervene to make us worse.
Regardless of charge, like I don't even think I heard your testimony, Secretary, on that point, and I don't even think it crystallized for me that it's regardless of the charge of the lead charge.
Right. That's why we're so great at diversion. We kick so much ass at diversion because we don't have to do anything. And I want to make sure we don't do anything, partly because it sucks resources into the end of the system, and partly because if they sit in waiting rooms with kids with 4 or 5 prior arrests, they're probably going to learn a bunch of things we don't want them to learn.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway.
Well, that's an interesting segue to me, because, we're thinking about what to do next meeting. And what I had in my mind was that we were going to have to wait months to do anything more on this issue of auto charging. And we should move on, and maybe we should move on to diversion. Although I do think an area ripe for reform is that pre-charging diversion, where SAO coordinates better with DJS. So SAO is accepting DJS recommendations for diversions, even on felonies. So Susan and I were discussing moving on to, the front end of the system, but now I'm feeling differently. So I'll pose it to Susan and the group. Do we stay on auto charging for a bit more, or do we wait until the data's back, kind of re-engage in that discussion and move on to something else?
I just have one. Vinny, when you said that, you don't want to get into finger pointing, you can talk about juvenile services, but our commission isn't just on juvenile services. Our commission is on, the system. And the system is much broader than, I'll be very interested, because one of the things that the last commission didn't do, they were supposed to put together a dashboard of what are the other services, how do you get the other services, who, and that never happened. That was one of the things they left for future. And I don't think it's ever happened. So I don't think we can reform juvenile justice by just looking at juvenile services. In fact, I think we need to be looking at way up, so many other things. So that's my concern about that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that we would never get it. I'm just saying how we get it and how it gets revealed, I think could be very important. I mean, my experience with these kind of collaborative efforts, and, I see Nate's got his hand up, Casey, really kind of I learned a lot from the JDI initiative, 30 plus years of it, was that people got to step forward together. Data is a really, really sensitive thing. And so I don't want to turn the judges off by Jenny saying, and it took 6 weeks for this thing to come over. I'd rather we are all exposing ourselves rather than some of us exposing others, because then that builds up defensiveness and can thwart efforts at reform. And this is me being circumspect. So circle this day on your calendar, okay?
I think we can do it here. I always let Alicia lead the meetings because she's much more diplomatic than I. And I think that, so we know like our strengths and weaknesses, and we're like trying to, we can all work together to make this happen in a good way.
You're muted.
I think Denise was talking before about how like the courts are, different from place to place. And I think they were trying to explain insights on the processes of the system, that the comment about how it's different depending on where a kid is, I think is really going to be important to explain. And I mean that, like, in some ways, like we were just talking about it with youth charged adults, but understand, like, we don't understand. I was saying this the other work group too, like what percentage of kids who come to DJS intake are coming because of something that happens at school versus something that happens in the community. Well, that's pretty important to understand, because that, I'm guessing, is wildly different by county, which means like the thing that is getting kids coming to the front of the system, the thing that's instigating the start of the process of the system, is happening in schools by county police officers versus in the community. Understanding those processes. So it's not just about the data, it's not just about the numbers, but if we're talking about the process, like, how does it work? Like, literally, how does it work? What is the decision-making process in Harford County versus Montgomery County? Like, what does that mean? Is it similar from place to place, and how that's happening? What happens next? Like, how intake is happening, police diversion. Like, we know there's places where there's diversion happening by police so that DJS never even sees the kid. Vinny doesn't even know they exist. So that might even, the one and done numbers might even be better than we even think, because there are kids who don't even come to intake who are getting arrested. And I feel like, I don't know the timeline of like what's most urgent, where it's like this year we got to get these things. But I feel like that picture is really important to understand. That DJS Data Resource Guide has so much information in it. And I know we've, like, compared to most states, it's just so much more data, so much more descriptive of what's going on. But it still leaves out so much of like the system, like what it means for a kid in Maryland to be in the juvenile justice system. And I think that those processes I'd like to understand a whole lot more. And so I think Vinny's point of like, how do we bring lots of people forward? How do we bring people into this and in roles that just aren't talked about in the same way as they're part of the system? And I'd love to hear ideas about how to do that, but I think it's really important in this committee to talk about those processes.
That makes perfect sense to me. And, we've talked about that before, Nate. Thank you so much. So, I mean, well, maybe I'm thinking about it differently than you all, but I think that one way to proceed to our next meeting is to stick on the issue of auto charging and dig into the processes. And it seems like DJS, Jenny, you may be in a position to make some kind of presentation to us on that, or am I misunderstanding?
No, I'd happily do that. What I would do is do a basic case process. I'd show you some of what DJS is doing to improve our side of the house. and where those numbers have gone for us. I can show you some aggregate numbers of what we're working on for supervising our TOJ investigators. And then I can walk you through a case process for, I could do, I'll do 5 basic cases, and I'll do one from Cap South, which is the DMV region, one from Baltimore City, and one from Central region. I can do a very serious charge and a first-time handgun possession, and walk you through what those case processes look for those different young people happily.
Yeah, and so perhaps that makes sense. I mean, I guess the other option would be to table that. No, we're going to do that when we get the data back, and move on to a processes discussion about the front end of the system. Which do folks prefer? I'm mostly looking at Susan, of course, Secretary, Nate, and Denise.
Can you give the choices again?
So it would be to stick on this issue of auto charging, and turn to a discussion next meeting about processes like Nate's talking about. We're waiting for the data to come back. Now let's look at case processing, in the realm of auto charging. That's number one. Number two is to table auto charging until we get the data back. Know that Jenny at some point is going to do a presentation on processes, and we next meeting turn our attention to the front end of the system, like Nate was just talking about. So which do we prefer?
That's a tough one. I will say, I just want to add something that I've been working with Bianca Bersani at the University of Maryland to do research on the front end of the system, because we have kind of a nice natural experiment. In June of 22, DJS got the power to divert nonviolent felony cases. We did so, and we lost that power in November of 24. So, we'll have a real sort of turn it on, turn it off moment. And Bianca's going to study that and see, what are the outcomes? Are they better or worse when DJS does it? Or when either prosecutors do it or it doesn't get done? Does it happen more frequently with DJS than with prosecutors? So we'll have some data on that. I don't know when Bianca's going to get done. If we were going to look at those processes, I'd really, like in New York, this was such a non-issue for me because those kids just were not even hardly touching my system. And here there's so much attention paid to them, and I'm under such pressure around them, the front end kids, because there's thousands of them. So no matter how good, I think the last data I saw from John was 94% of them don't have a new adjudication within a year, which means that 6% of thousands of kids have a new adjudication within a year. And of course, that's all people focus on. That's all the courts and prosecutors and cops see back. And so there's real calls for us to do more at the front end, even though 71% of the times those kids will just not come back all by themselves. So, I definitely could use help in that area. But which comes first? I'm somewhat ambivalent, and I mean it in the literal sense of the word, about that. I don't have a real strong opinion. Circle this day on your calendar for that too. I almost always have a strong opinion. Jenny, what do you?
Susan?
I think, we're started on this. Let's have Jenny do it next time. But taking what, Nate, are you saying that, would it be helpful to have at some point, I don't know if we could do it next time, but like maybe somebody from the police or somebody from the schools, or, so that it doesn't look like we're just looking at juvenile services, but that we want to hear from everybody. And
yeah, I feel like when we go and work, if we're working in a place like my team, if we were going somewhere, one of the first things we would do is like a system mapping exercise. you know, and you're bringing everybody in the room because like there's this thing where, and this would be no different here in Maryland, right? Where there's things that you would think would be like objective truths, like this is how it works. There's step A, and then there's step B, and then there's step C, and you're in a room of people who work together all the time, and they tell you, someone lays it out. This is how it works. It's A, and then B, and then C, and then someone else goes, well, wait a sec. What about all those cases where remember and then all of a sudden A becomes like it's not just A. There's 4 versions of A. And then there's 3 versions of B. It's like that way of understanding like how it all works and the different roles people have and how that impacts these data are important. I don't know that it's important that we start there. I'm just commenting that I think I'm wondering when Vinny's talking about what he's hearing and the narrative of like the revolving door of a system that there's data that's going to go, what do you mean the revolving door? 96% of the kids, nothing, you know, we divert them and nothing happens. And someone else has this other thing. So I do think it's important to understand how different people are viewing the situation. And a lot of what can get confusing is people arguing about data when they're not looking at the same thing. They're not seeing the same numbers. So I do think that I don't know if it's I don't know. I don't have a timeline of when I'm thinking one thing should precede another, but I do think it's going to be important. And I think this whole process would be better by having more stakeholders in this room, like being in here and being able to talk about like how it's working.
We do have representation from the bench in Judge Weathersby, who's not present today. We also have representation from SAO in Lacey Davis, who's also not present today. And so I think it's important, you know, Susan, I hear you. Why don't, Jenny, if you're willing, why don't you present to us next time? But I do think that, to Nate's point, it's important for law enforcement and SAO and the bench to be present at that next meeting. And we've got the membership. I'm sorry, Sheriff Baker is our law enforcement representative. And so, you know, maybe we'll reach out, maybe I'll do an extra reach out to them to make sure that they're present for the next meeting. Does that sound like a good way to proceed?
Yes, I like that.
Bethany?
I agree.
Okay, thank you, Denise. Bethany,
You
go
know,
ahead.
Sometimes when you have people have to say something, then they come. So maybe I'm just trying to see how we can include people in a way where they feel they're part of the well, we can, you know, the whole committee doesn't have to deal with that. We'll try to figure that out.
Yeah, for sure. I hear you. Bethany, go ahead.
I was going to flag that we have Liz Park on the call too. She's named not available. So I don't know if she already spoke up, but she did put it in the chat. And Nate, about kind of mapping things out. That's something that we've talked about doing, but with kind of a bigger view towards like where our process as well as intervention points. So in community, in the system, out is kind of something that we would love to see come out of this. Like I don't know how familiar any of you are with the sequential intercept model, but that's something that our office does. It's kind of mapping in terms of behavioral health and system involvement, specifically kind of what's the path and what are all the various points at which someone could be resourced to divert them from the system. So we can send around some materials that show what we've done, the work that we've done for adults. We do that county by county, which is kind of what we've had some difficulty conceptualizing for how to do it through the commission on a state level. But I could see some, like, you know, as clear as we can get about it being, there may be some variation from place to place, but generally this is how the process works and where all of the different opportunities are.
Great. And hi, Liz. Sorry about that. I didn't see you here. Oh, thanks, Ainsley.
Yeah, Bethany, I would
Can you
love
put
those
that in
tools and
the-
resources. If you want it mapped in that way, I can definitely try to build what I present in that format.
that form. And Ainsley,
and I
can you
was
put that in the
Like, maybe
Dropbox?
in your
Okay.
presentation, but just that's something that like kind of big goals for the commission later on is to have some.
No, I know, but I like to think about it in that way where I'm
Okay.
like, I could map this into an interception point for y'all. Yeah.
Awesome.
Well, thanks everybody. Thanks for being together on this Spring Friday. And we'll see everybody next month and we'll keep moving forward. Susan, anything else? All right, thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Have
Thank
a good
you.
weekend.